screen share's working, recording's on. You've got 40 minutes, Joe, or
Cool.
35 minutes.
So yeah, so a very quick introduction to who we are. We're just over 100 people based in Europe, but we have a growing office in New York City. I'm sitting in Brussels, and yeah, we have, as Clarissa's mentioned, we have, well, our biggest single client is the European Commission. So we've been heavily involved in developing what Andy referred to earlier as the circular economy package. And so this is kind of back in 6 or 7 years ago that started, and really heavily involved in development of all of the main EU policy on circular economy and waste management since then, including on plastics and things like the Single-Use Plastics Directive, on EPR, etc. But that's actually a relatively small part of what we do. So I think one of the interesting things about us is we work across the whole of society in a way. So we work with NGOs on very kind of early stage thinking on emerging policy topics, and we then kind of work around this cycle, working with the supranational policy organizations like the European Commission, national governments, state governments, municipalities. We try to really understand how stuff actually happens on the ground. So we work with lots of recyclers, waste management companies, technology companies, and then everyone in the product value chain as well. So everyone from the raw materials up to the brand owners and retailers. And yeah, hopefully that gives us the insight to give good advice to the policymakers who are obviously doing very influential stuff. What we're going to cover a little bit more on the European context. I'm actually going to overlap a little bit with what Clarissa mentioned. We'll tell you a lot more about our ongoing study for the Commission on measurement of recycled content. And then we'll finish with a few takeaways as much as we've got them at this stage. And then hopefully we have plenty of time for questions and discussion. I wanted to just, obviously, the EU is a very different situation to North America. We have, as Clarissa mentioned, effectively a kind of executive that is our client with this type of work, the European Commission, and they propose and develop draft legislation, which, if it's a directive, applies to all member states in the EU. Sadly, there's only 27 now, Clarissa, but you know, it's effectively a kind of quasi-federal system, but where the states have to implement their own legislation based on that union-wide directive. And I'm just going to pick up on a few things. This is really just a small part of what's out there on circular economy. We have very high mandatory recycling targets using this new calculation method, which I'll mention a bit more about in a moment, but also things like, for instance, a mandatory target for separate collection of plastic beverage bottles up at 90% by 2029. So really kind of as high as you can go with a mandatory target across a population this big. We've got the kind of quite sophisticated now EPR requirements, minimum requirements, including this kind of idea of modulation of fees, which is now mandatory in all EPR schemes where possible. We've got this pretty groundbreaking law on recycled content in beverage bottles, and that kind of married up with this separate collection target on beverage. but I think what it's actually doing is highlighting where we're going next in Europe, and we're working with the Commission at the moment on developing further mandatory recycled content measures beyond beverage, and so going into other product categories. Obviously, there's a big contrast here with North America, and I think the global relevant thing that's happening is that we have brand owners making voluntary commitments, actually some of which substantially exceed what we have on, for instance, the recycled content targets in EU legislation. So we know, a number of the big beverage brands have committed to 50% recycled content. That is driving this kind of, proliferation of certification schemes. That's helping us with our project for the Commission to design this calculation method, but it's also highlighting the fact here that as with the voluntary commitments that many industry players have made, the EU set these targets before they've worked out how they were going to measure performance against them. And so one thing we would really highlight is the need for those to work together as a system, that the target and the calculation method. I want to just quickly tell you a bit more about the recycling rate calculation that Clarissa mentioned. This isn't the subject of today, but it is an important starting point in Europe, because we now have this kind of mandatory, consistent method of calculating recycling rates across the EU. Now, I'm just going to show you quickly where that comes from. It's from the Waste Framework Directive. There's the same kind of idea is duplicated for packaging, and basically the kind of, not only is it intended to be consistent across the EU, but as Clarissa said, the idea is to measure at the point where you've kind of got rid of the losses before you actually go into the recycling process. You're not counting those losses. So in the case of a beverage package, it might be labels, it might be lids, it might be residual content, it might be other contamination on the exterior or whatever. And that we're measuring at the point that that material enters the recycling operation. So we're taking the measurement point further into the recycling process. And to give you an idea of what that means for plastic, we've traditionally measured recycling at the point where maybe we've collected plastic separately, or we've sorted it by polymer and color, and we've baled it and sent it to a recycler. Where we're moving to now is calculating basically at something equivalent to the washed flake stage. So you've got all of that, substantial losses to deduct from the recycling calculation. And we think for plastic, that's going to be 30 to 40% reduction in recycling rates. And we have, for instance, for packaging, we have quite high. We have a 55% mandatory recycling target for plastic packaging by 2030. That's all kind of getting everyone used to the idea of these very consistent, clear calculation methods. It's also revealing all sorts of complications and unintended consequences with using them. But I think a really important thing it's doing is helping us to realize that we need to have metrics to measure the point at which all this effort on recycling is actually delivering some benefit. And that's where recycled content is incredibly important, because even what we're measuring here isn't achieving any benefit. Washed flakes we're not displacing any virgin material at that point. And if we're sort of thinking about this in the context of climate change, it's the point at which materials actually make it into new products that we get these savings, these carbon emissions benefits. And we know we get those substantially from carbon intensive materials like plastics and metals and textiles, but we don't get anything until we get stuff into a new product. So I'm going to hand over to Simon in a moment, but I'm going to just introduce the study that we're carrying out for the Commission at the moment on introducing this mandatory measurement method to go along with these targets. And I'm just putting up here the wording from the Single-Use Plastics Directive, Article 6.5, and this is helps us with actually thinking about how the calculation needs to work. And as Clarissa mentioned, we've got a target of 25% for PET in 2025, and then 30% for all plastic bottles by 2030. But what we're interested in here, and when we're thinking about the calculation, is that it's a percentage of the recycled plastic as a proportion of all of the beverage bottles placed on the market in a particular territory. And so we're starting to have some terms to define within the calculation. In terms of the objectives for the project that we're doing, I mean, the place to start is with the policy objectives themselves. So why mandatory recycled content targets? And for Europe, that's about increasing uptake of secondary material, and in so doing, supporting the demand side. So we're setting all these targets around recycling rates. It's pushing material onto the market, secondary material onto the market, and we need to intervene more to stimulate demand. And what the EU is particularly focused on is both increasing overall demand and shifting demand into what they're increasingly defining more clearly as high quality recycling applications. So where we get the maximum benefit from that recycling. In terms of what the project is trying to do, we've got three main packages of tasks, I guess. One is to develop a general method for calculation, verification, reporting of recycled content in plastic products. The idea of that is to use that methodology in all future requirements, legal requirements on recycled content. Secondly, to adapt that to the very specific case of these targets, mandatory targets we have in the Single-Use Plastics Directive. And there, our work is going to go effectively directly into what's called an implementing act, a piece of secondary legislation under the directive, which is going to bring that those calculation rules into the law in every country. As you saw, the targets aren't that aggressive, actually. 25 to 30% for plastic beverage bottles. If you've got a 90% collection rate, probably isn't a massively challenging target, but it's viewed very much as the starting point. And we'll talk more about the relationship between targets and metrics in a moment. And then what we need to do is simulate some adaptations of that general method to some other product categories. So probably packaging, automotive, electrical and electronic equipment, construction materials and textiles. And we'll be picking 3 or 4 out of that list, but those are the most likely candidates based on what we know the EU is aiming for. And I think if you want to really know what's coming next in Europe, the Circular Economy Action Plan is a really good, relatively short document, recently published document to read. And that really is identifying the sort of priority industries for the next few years of legislation. But the kind of fundamental objective is to ensure that the performance against these mandatory targets can be accurately and consistently measured between member states, that we're not getting distortion of competition, we're not getting different signals being sent to industry in different jurisdictions. And from the engagement we're having with brand owners, we know that this is, they would like to see consistency in the way that these targets are measured, because it's going to be, firstly, very helpful from a process management point of view within their businesses, and secondly, from a credibility point of view, having to report against multiple different standards is quite unhelpful when you're going to get a lot of scrutiny from citizens and from civil society. Having said all of that, there's a lot to learn from the EU, but there are also quite big downsides from having this kind of very top-down approach. And so I think we're very open to, how do you cherry pick the best stuff from what's happening elsewhere and adapt it to your own situation. So I think it's not a kind of a simple template opportunity here. There's a lot to learn, but there's also a lot of further thinking for you to do. So I'm going to hand over to Simon, but I'll chip in a bit as Simon goes through the rest of the slides.
Great, thanks, Joe. So yeah, I'm going to go through a few interesting elements of what we've been finding that maybe you can learn from, and we're learning from as we're going as well, because we're right in the midst of trying to understand all of this at the moment, and the more you look into this, the more complicated it gets. And so you can see there the rather simple equation initially is, your percentage recycled content equals your mass of your recycled material over the mass of your product. The problem is when you actually get into the real detail of what actually these, how you define each one of these, that's when all of the problems start to arise. So, for example, when you're looking at bottles, the mass of your product, what is the mass of your product? Does it include the cap? Does it include any inks or any wrappers or anything else that goes with it? So really understanding, well, what are you trying to achieve by the recycled content target helps to focus what you might call the mass of the product. And that's the easy part of the equation, potentially. The harder part is, what is the mass of the recycled material itself, and how do you calculate that, and what might be included. So, for example, in plastic, do you include additives or not? And at what point do you say the additives are included, and whether they, at what point is your measurement point to include additives or not? And that's one of the potential issues around understanding what might be classed as recycled material from a simplistic concept. And then, so that all boils down to what exactly your recycled content target might be in the end. So, for example, here we've got the post-consumer versus pre-consumer material. So there's a reasonable consensus around what post-consumer might be, an argument potentially around what the consumer is, but generally, if it's a business or an individual, that's a fairly straightforward thing to look at. Pre-consumer or post-industrial, that's another thing altogether, unfortunately, because what constitutes post-industrial? Are you including post-industrial waste that has that will end up as a waste, so will definitely go to landfill, or are you including waste that actually, as a matter of course, just gets reclaimed back into the process, and you're giving the system credit for that? And if you've decided which one of those scenarios sounds like a good idea, how do you go about defining that? Because it's actually surprisingly difficult to draw the line in a descriptive way that doesn't allow adverse consequences to come into the calculation. So again, this comes back to, well, think about exactly what you're trying to achieve from this recycled content target in the first place. If the thing you're trying to achieve is actually driving through post-consumer material, because that's the thing that actually is stuck at the moment, then maybe don't include pre-consumer. But if you do include pre-consumer, you should perhaps think about changing the target accordingly, so the target might be slightly bigger. So there's lots of arguments for and against, and a lot of the NGO community would be against pre-consumer being included. But really, you can include it if you just adapt the target accordingly. So you might, rather than having a 50% rate, you might want to have a 60%. So really, the point is that your target should really reflect what you want to include in it. And that's perhaps a really good learning point from that you can take from the EU, is actually they've done it the opposite way to what we would ideally want to see, which is work out what you want to include in the target and then set the target based on that. Right now they've set the target, and now we've got to work out how exactly we meet that. The rules are sort of a bit backwards because of that, and you've got to retrofit the rules to make sure the target makes sense and it's not too easy to meet and not too hard to meet. So that would be a one big takeaway that you should think about, is exactly what you want to achieve and what you want to include in it, and then set the target accordingly.
And obviously the history of the voluntary targets, the voluntary commitments, has been exactly the same. People have set targets before they've had any kind of detailed thinking about how they'd be measured. We've been reviewing a lot of the existing certification schemes, and finding that even within a scheme, they're sometimes defining the same activity differently. And so you could be doing the same thing and declaring getting a different result out of that scheme. And so, yeah, if you're going to do something mandatory, obviously it's much more important that there's a high degree of consistency.
Yeah, that sort of brings us on to how you verify this recycled content, and the fact that there are at the moment quite a lot of schemes that are voluntary, that allow you to verify it through third-party certification. They will go along your entire supply chain and verify everything is in the correct order, and so that what goes into the process really matches what comes out of the process, with varying degrees of how liberal the approach is towards allowing certain things. So one of the key things that what we were trying to do for this project, but also we would recommend more generally, is that you don't allow a free-for-all around how you go about this chain of custody approach, that you define the approach very solidly throughout. Another good example of how perhaps not to go about this is, very recently the UK have announced how they intend to go about their target, which is it's a tax, but on if you have less than 30% recycled content in your product, then you are subject to that tax. But what they are allowing is any third-party certification scheme is allowed, it is capable of producing the evidence for that target. So essentially, that right now these verification schemes are, you know, on a reasonably level playing field, because they're competing in the same space. They don't want to have a poorly credible scheme. They want to actually be able to give strong claims to whoever is being audited. But if there's a recycled content claim associated with that that's based in law, and then there's a benefit associated with having a weaker claim, then you're essentially creating a race to the bottom, and the claim then becomes meaningless. And in the UK, the tax might become meaningless. Now, I think there's going to be a lot of pushback in the UK to make sure that doesn't happen. But it's one of these things where the initial thoughts and legislation comes out, and it's come out in a way that seems counterproductive. So we would definitely recommend avoiding that sort of approach, and be as strict as you can with what the chain of custody approach and what can be done, but giving them enough latitude that they can choose which auditor they would want to use in this. Next slide. Yeah, so looking at the different kinds of recycling processes that this might apply to. So mechanical recycling is your traditional recycling process, if you will, where you're essentially bringing in the recycler or the bottles in this case, cutting them up, washing them, putting them back through the process. It's a fairly linear process, and the way you would measure the recycled content in this case is to make sure that all your losses, so you've got those black arrows down there, the residues, moisture, all the regrind, the purging, all of these things basically are removed from the equation, and anything you put in also has to be part of the equation as well. But because mechanical recycling has this clear mass flow going through it, it's a relatively easy equation to put together. The arguments are just around what is and isn't included, and it's a relatively straightforward process in that regard. But there was obviously a lot of negotiation around how you actually define what is and isn't included, though. Of perhaps more interest in terms of how difficult this can be is the non-mechanical recycling, as we've called it, which includes modern chemical recycling processes, which are a lot of them are very much emerging at the current time. So this is a diagram that we produced for a report that we've also written fairly recently, giving an overview of chemical recycling that we wrote for an NGO called ChemTrust. We understand that there's a lot of excitement around chemical recycling. It can potentially be used to recycle our way out of some of the problems we've backed ourselves into with regard to some of the packaging materials that are currently unrecyclable, such as multi-layer films. The truth of that is probably a little more nuanced, but these are genuine technologies that are coming to the fore, and unfortunately make the recycled content calculation a lot more complicated. So in this case, we've got three broad technologies: thermal depolymerization, which is where you use heat to break down the polymer into its constituent parts; a chemical depolymerization, which is where you use chemicals themselves to depolymerize, so less heat, but you actually use the chemicals, and that goes straight back to a monomer. And a solvent purification there, which is technically not a chemical recycling process, but it is a novel physical process where you essentially dissolve the material and then reconstitute it later on without the impurities potentially. So all of these technologies we're considering within the rules, because the idea is we want to have a level playing field for different technologies. We don't want to stifle innovation, but recognizing that we also want to encourage the recycled content claims to be as strong as possible, and that's a very fine balance that we're working with there. Next slide, please. So here's some of the issues that we're grappling with on this at the moment. So when your plastic waste goes into your chemical recycling plant, you don't just get plastic out the other end, unfortunately, like you would with a mechanical recycling process. You might get a number of different co-products. So you might get fuels, monomers, polymers, different hydrocarbons and chemicals coming out the other end. There's a lot of detail I could go into this, but I'm going to keep it fairly brief, and feel free to ask questions about how you allocation and things like that later on. But generally speaking, in Europe, we define any fuel that comes out of the back end of any recycling process as a recovery operation, and that's down below recycling in the waste hierarchy. So that's fuel, plastic to fuel is essentially a lower order recycling process in Europe, and we know that conversation is definitely an ongoing thing in the US and Canada, but it's essentially a done deal in Europe. But a lot of these chemical recycling processes, fuels are an output, as well as some of the key constituents that actually go directly into a polymer themselves. So there's essentially quite a lot of losses in the process, and understanding where those losses are and making sure that the claims around that are sensible and fair is a really important part of this. So to give you an idea about how you might go about this, there's the concept of mass balance. So this is where in the chemical industry, you can't actually trace the mass flows through because they all go into one big melting pot, essentially. So you might have virgin and recycled feedstocks go into one big process, and out comes a lot of other products. So how do you assign those? You also might have on the same site a number of these processes, and then in your company a number of other sites, all putting together material that and flowing in and out, and it's a really complex thing. So for the strongest possible claim, you'd want to go with batch level, which is your feedstock is followed through the process, and it mixes together, and your claim out of the back end of it is exactly the same as what goes into the product. So you'll see there you've got 15 and 15 going in. So your possible claims, your strongest claim is the one at the bottom there, which is a 50% recycled content. And that would be the ideal for everyone in terms of having a strong, credible claim. Unfortunately for the chemicals industry, it tends to be a lot more complex than that, because there's not actually that much recycled feedstock available at the moment. So it wouldn't be a 15 and 15, it might be a 1 and 1,000, 1,000 being your virgin feedstock. So what they don't want is to then be able to sell a product that has 0.001% recycled content, because that's not a saleable product for them, and it doesn't drive the use of recycled feedstock for them. So what they want to do is aggregate all of their different facilities, all of the recycled content into one, so that they can make a stronger claim, potentially 100% recycled content of a specific batch. The problem with that is, as you might have gathered, that the potential is you might be selling a ton of recycled content, and it actually have no recycled content in it whatsoever. So that becomes a bit of an issue when it comes to credibility, how you convey that to consumers, how brands convey that, because you essentially have two different levels of claim, one strong claim for mechanical recycling and one weaker claim for mass balance from chemical recycling. So, but we recognize that there has to be some give on this to make sure that we don't prevent these technologies from even existing at all, and there has to be a level playing field. So we're in the midst of trying to negotiate rules in which makes these claims as strong as they can be, but without preventing these industries from even developing their technologies whatsoever. So there's a lot of big chemical companies that are very interested in this, but they're all sort of standing at the sidelines at the moment, waiting to see what happens, because they're not willing to invest billions in this just yet. And in case, one slip of the pen in any legislation and suddenly they're out of the market. So it's a very delicate balance as to how to include these technologies, but without undermining entirely the whole recycled content process and the target itself. So I think, yeah, I could definitely go into a lot more detail there, but I'll keep that. I keep it at that for the moment. So just to summarize the key principles that we'd like you to take away from this, and that we're sort of coming to the fore from what we're finding at the moment. As I said before, designing targets and measurement rules that work together. So this is the case of approaching it where you can have stricter rules with less ambitious targets, which is essentially what the EU is doing and what we're attempting to do. Or you could have more liberal targets and more liberal ways of calculating it. So it's balancing, you know, what's achievable. So you might have it might be easier to get a higher target through, but being more generous with how you allow that target to be reached. And that might be more politically palatable, and certainly easier for certain industries to buy into that. So that might be a way of doing it. But the point is that you should always match the target with how you intend to go about it, rather than setting a target and then wondering how you actually meet that and it not really joining up together in the end.
And one of the key issues there is that obviously it's the target which is the headline grabbing element. No one, you know, brands don't make huge announcements about this really robust calculation method and certification scheme they've signed up to. They want to make an announcement about a 50% or a 70% recycled content target, and the same goes obviously for legislators and policymakers. And I think, yeah, what we would very much urge you to do is to really think about what it is you're measuring before you set the target, or in an integrated way with setting the target. And it's always easier to increase a target over time than it is to realize you've you know, overdone it. And we're seeing, for instance, on beverage, some brands committing to 100% recycled content for some of their lines. We've done a lot of work on PET recyclability and what, you know, how that might shake out over in a situation where you have very high collection rates and maximized recycled content, and 100% isn't really a valid target. In fact, you know, from probably around 70 is, from a technical point of view, you might be looking at the ceiling for a clear PET bottle anyway. And so you need to be really thinking about what it is what you're trying to achieve and what you're trying to measure before you jump for a headline grabbing target announcement.
Yeah, and that leads on quite well to some of these other points, which are sort of variations on that same theme, really. You know, when it comes to the definitions of in the scope of the denominator and the numerator, as I said before, very easy conceptually, but then when you get into the detail, the nuts and bolts of exactly what those are, you realize you have to define those quite strongly. So we've actually got an easier job than other potential targets which just look at plastic as a whole, because we're looking at a specific product, so we can get very specific with how we define things, and it removes the ambiguity of it. So yeah, that's definitely something that the devil is in the detail with those, and that should be a clear focus. And equally, proportionality. So where should you prioritize? So this comes back to one of the issues I was talking about previously around do you include certain aspects or not? Which battles are you going to fight when it comes to choosing how to go about the calculation? So the pre and post consumer argument as well. Where to draw the line? Actually, is it a big deal? And that really, the way you work that out is by really understanding the value chain and understanding the issues around that. So you will get people who argue very strongly against a certain point, but when you work it out, it's, you know, it might make, you know, 0.05% difference in your whole recycling rate. So is it really worth arguing that point over? And is it really creating a massive loophole in what you're doing? So so really understanding the value chain as you go through that process makes those arguments a lot easier to win, and reduces the amount of speculation involved. And as I was speaking about in the previous slides, being neutral about the technology is obviously a noble way of going about it, and the way that I think seems straightforward you definitely want to do that, but the problem with that is it becomes very difficult when you're trying to second guess innovative technologies and how they might fit into the system. So one of the things you could do is have different levels of claims for different systems, with a potential to strengthen those claims as these technologies become more mature in the future. So you're not drawing a line in the sand right now. You give them a bit of latitude initially to make sure that the technology isn't stifled, but then introduce stronger levels of claim later on. But definitely, I don't think we're going to solve this issue just with mechanical recycling on its own. But equally, a lot of chemical recycling technologies are seen as the panacea of all of our plastic issues, and that's probably not quite the case either. So integrating this with other legislation like EPR and looking at reduction, as was said right at the beginning of the process of this meeting, it isn't about recycling. You can't recycle your way out of this problem 100%. So looking at reduction and reuse as well is definitely a key part of that, and integrating that together is also really important.
And I think on the this kind of, you know, striking the right balance between these issues and, you know, targeting the biggest risks around where you might see overstatement of recycled content. That's kind of, I guess, what we're most focused on. So yeah, making sure that, for instance, the ways that you deal with the non-mechanical recycling technologies ensure that there isn't an unfair advantage being given to those technologies, because actually the total claims that are being made and verified are more than the amount of genuine recycled content that's getting through those processes. That's kind of priority number one. And then kind of thinking about how rigorous, how kind of strict and inflexible does the system need to be to give you a credible credible performance against a mandatory target. We're doing a lot of engagement with brand owners who are obviously very concerned about the credibility of something of a metric that they're using, but also want to be able to use the full range of technologies available to them. So we're going to finish there with our slides. We can go back to anything that people want to go into in more detail very easily. And I'll just stop sharing for now.